In this presentation, we are going to be discussing the main differences between the two parliamentary systems in Europe during the 17th century. Specifically, this refers to absolutism and parliamentarianism. We will be discussing the two ideological points of view towards this, but also the practicalities of the two parliamentary systems. The idea of having an absolutist monarch may seem very far removed from our reality today. However, the idea that a monarch had supernatural abilities was very common in the past, and specifically during the 17th century. This was known as the divine right of a king, or the royal touch. Essentially, the divine right of a king is the belief that the monarch derives their right to rule directly from God, and therefore is subject to no unearthly authority. In other words, this means that the king is not compelled to the wills of his people, aristocrats, or even the church. According to this belief, only God can judge the king, and if any person was to deem the king unjust or unfair, he was accused of disobeying the will of God. The theory of the divine right hit the height of its popularity at a time when people were most impressionable. Therefore, this allowed monarchs to magnify their power throughout their kingdoms. In modernity, it seems very implausible that monarchs possess supernatural abilities. However, the idea that a monarch had supernatural abilities was very common during the 17th century, and these abilities were known as the divine right of kings, or the royal touch. Essentially, the divine right of a king is the belief that the monarch derives their right to rule directly from God. Therefore, is subject to no earthly authority. In other words, this means that the king is not compelled to the wills of his people, aristocrats, or even the church. According to this belief, only God can judge the king, and if any person was to deem the king unjust or unfair, he was accused of disobeying the will of God. The theory of the divine right also hit the height of its popularity at a time when people were most impressionable. Before the Glorious Revolution in 1688, which we'll come on to later, and before the American and French revolutions later on in the 17th century, the lack of accurate medical and technological knowledge at the time meant that religion played an integral role in many people's lives. Therefore, the theory of the divine right of a king was very plausible to most and also gave them hope. In order to maintain power as an absolutist monarch, many monarchs created a centralized administration. This administration was a system of governance whereby civil servants and courtiers ensured that the monarch's orders were obeyed throughout the kingdom. It is important to highlight that these civil servants and courtiers did not possess any legal or legislative power. These civil servants and courtiers would have obeyed every rule of the king or queen. In addition to this, the centralized administration would have also included a strong, cohesive army. The army would have sworn an oath to the monarch in order to obey their demands. The army also collected taxes from the paupers and also the commoners. By collecting these taxes, it was able to make the army stronger. By making the army stronger meant that the monarch's power was secured throughout the kingdom. King Louis XIV of France is a very good example of an absolutist monarch. He is famous for saying that I am the state and believing in one king, one law, and one faith. He, like other absolutist monarchs during this period, controlled all powers of state. By this, we refer to the law, religion, and also the estate. By creating a centralized administration whereby the army increased and taxation throughout the land increased, Louis XIV was able to maintain power. As I said in the previous slides, at this period, many people had hope and faith in religion, and therefore did believe that their monarchs were and derived their divine right to rule directly from God. In a declaration to Parliament in 1666, King Louis XIV justified his absolutist approach to monarchy by saying, "Let it not be forgotten that sovereign power resides in me alone, that it is exclusively from me that my courts obtain their justice and authority, that the plenitude of this authority, which is exercised in my name, always remains embodied in me, and that its use can never be set against me. That is to me that legislative power belongs, that all public order emanates from my person." In this excerpt, Louis XIV emphasizes that by divine right, it is his power alone to administer justice, the law, and authority, and that these things cannot be used against him, as by doing so, it is sacrilege. He emphasized that it is he alone that can administer justice, the law, and authority. We are now moving on to the second part of the presentation, where we will be comparing parliamentarianism to absolutism. Unlike under an absolutist system, the power of a monarch under parliamentarianism is limited by a form of parliament or governing body. This governing body represents the interests of the three estates: the clergy, which is the church, nobility, which is the courtiers, and commoners. In 17th century England, many, such as philosopher John Locke, defended the view that Parliament should exert control over the monarch. He said, "It is common practice in well-organised powers that legislative power is placed in the hands of a number of people, who, in the form of an assembly, have the power to make laws. These laws need to be implemented and respected, and it is necessary that there is a power to oversee the putting into practice of these laws, as well as their application. This is why the legislative and executive powers are usually kept separate." Therefore, many people referring to themselves as parliamentarianisms oppose the semi-absolutist rule of Charles I, a very unpopular king who was keen on maintaining absolute power. As a result of this, civil war broke out and Charles I was executed and replaced by parliamentarian Oliver Cromwell, who was known as the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, in an attempt to abolish the monarchy in favour of a republic. After a short period of English republic, the less controversial King Charles II was restored as king, but it wasn't until 1688 that his son, King James II, was forced to give up his throne in favour of King William of Orange, a parliamentarian. 1 year after his coronation, he introduced the Bill of Rights, obliging the king and all his heirs to obey the laws of Parliament. And ever since this day, monarchs have had to abide by the Bill of Rights in the UK. Unlike Louis XIV of France, King William of Orange expresses his limited power as a parliamentarian monarch in England. He says that the pretended power of suspending the laws or the execution of laws by regal authority without consent of Parliament is illegal, that levying money for or as to the Crown without grant of Parliament is also illegal, and that for redress of all grievances and for the amending, strengthening and preserving of the laws, Parliaments ought to be held frequently. So here we can see that King William of Orange and King Louis XIV of France were very different ruling monarchs. As an absolutist monarch, King Louis XIV had the power to act without consent of Parliament. However, King William of Orange was not able to act without consent of Parliament and could not abolish or create any laws without consent of Parliament. In addition to this, under a parliamentary system, there is a very distinct focus on the preservation of laws and the protection of maintaining laws. Whereas under an absolutist monarch, the monarch has the ability to be able to abolish or create laws without being limited by any other governing body. And essentially, this is the main differences between the two systems. And in the next slide, we're going to be discussing, in a small little breakdown, the key differences between absolutism and parliamentarianism. After we do that, there will be a quiz at the end of the presentation that you'll be able to take to see whether you've understood it. If you are struggling with it, please get into contact with either Laura or myself for any more information. We are now at the end of the presentation, where it is important to summarise the main differences between the two parliamentary systems in Europe in the 17th century. In brief, the main difference between absolutism and parliamentarianism is the role of the monarch. An absolutist monarch is authoritarian, and their power is not limited by any form of governing body like that of a parliamentarian monarch. Absolutism is founded in the belief that the monarch has the right to rule derived by God and only God, whilst a parliamentarian system limits the power of the monarch. Absolutist monarchs formed centralised administrations consisting of the army, courtiers and allies that ensured that the will of the monarch was administrated throughout the whole kingdom, whilst parliamentary monarchs were held accountable by a government representing the interests of the three estates. Finally, and more simply, an absolutist monarch possessed executive and legislative powers, while a parliamentarian monarch shared the legislative power with their government.